Good day to everyone present here and a warm welcome to the quantum information theory section of the talk series. Hope you have been having a good time and a learning experience of the talk so far. During the course of this series of talks, may I request the audience to kindly turn off your microphone and video so that a smooth and uninterrupted session can take place. This video is also being recorded. Also, I would like to inform the attendees that at the end of each talk, we would be having a Q&A session. You may post your questions in the Google Meet or YouTube chat window. During the Q&A session, we will ask your questions from the chat to the speaker. You may also raise your hand in the Google Meet during the Q&A session, and then you'll be asked to unmute, and you may proceed to ask your questions. First up, we have a talk titled An Invitation to Quantum Technologies. This talk will be presented to you by Dr. R. Srikanth. Dr. R. Srikanth is an associate professor at Purna Prajna Institute of Scientific Research, Bangalore. His main interests include foundations of quantum mechanics, quantum cryptography, quantum information theory, and philosophy of science. After obtaining his PhD from IISc Bangalore, Dr. Srikanth worked as a postdoctoral scholar at the then Center of Theoretical Studies, IISc, and then at the Light and Matter Physics LAMP group at RRI, Bangalore. He joined PPISR as a faculty fellow in 2006, becoming an assistant professor in 2010. He is an associate editor for the journal Quanta.ws and a reviewer for various prestigious physics journals. He has guided 3 PhD students separately in the fields of quantum cryptography, quantum noise, and quantum foundations, and has authored and co-authored over 90 research papers and delivered over 50 invited talks. It's my pleasure to invite Dr. Srikanth for our first quantum information theory talk of the evening. Dr. Srikanth, the stage, rather should I say the screen, is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Varki, Professor Srinivas, and Mr. Vishnu, and your team for this kind invitation. Without further ado, thank you very much again for your introduction. And so I will begin my presentation without further ado. Is it visible clearly?
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Now, is it visible now? Could you let me know? Because I've made it full screen.
The slide is visible.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, as announced, my talk is an invitation to quantum technologies to try to intimate and to try to rouse your enthusiasm in this field, in which no doubt you are already interested to a certain extent. So I would begin with the various surprises in the quantum world. Perhaps the main surprise that one encounters is the quantum superposition principle, which says that unlike classical objects, a classical bit which can only take on values 0 and 1, a quantum bit, which is called a qubit, can simultaneously take on values which is 0 and 1, and which is represented as the superposition. It's important to stress that when I say that there's a simultaneous superposition of get values of 0 and 1, it doesn't mean that the qubit actually has a definite value and that we do not know what that value is. Instead, it is that nature herself is undecided and is simultaneously in the state of being 0 and 1. A related property is measurement disturbance, namely that when you measure a property A of a system, you would disturb another property B, which is conjugate or incompatible or complementary with it. For example, it's like saying that if you try to measure the height of a person, then you disturb the weight of a person, causing a certain uncertainty to appear, a fluctuation to appear in the weight of a person. Or conversely, if you measure weight, it's like saying that you make the height uncertain. So that's the kind of a strange phenomenon that we encounter in the quantum world. Again, a related non-classical feature in the quantum world is that when you make a measurement, so you can have 2 observables which are complementary, and as a result, these 2 observables, say A and B, cannot simultaneously take exact values. Instead, if you you could have a state in which B has an exact value, but if you try to measure A, you would generate a spectrum of values, and you can obtain the measurement entropy of it. And the sum of these entropies will always be larger than some minimum value, which we can tell to be, which should be something that is greater than 0. In the classical world, of course, you could have two properties, say the height and weight. Both of whose values are exactly known, and therefore the entropy of both of them would be actually 0, and so the value of C would be 0 in the classical world. But in quantum mechanics, depending on the observables A and B that you choose, the value of C could be greater than 0. Another surprise in the quantum world is the no cloning theorem, which essentially says that you cannot make a Xerox copy of an unknown quantum state. In the normal world, on our laptop, we often copy files, make copies of files. Right? So we take a file 1 and copy it into file 2. But if file 1 were an unknown quantum program, you could not make a copy of the program because of the no cloning theorem. Again, a related property is that if you have two non-orthogonal states, it's impossible to distinguish them perfectly. And of course, the most advertised, perhaps deservedly so, strangeness or weirdness of quantum mechanics is the entanglement property, which is essentially non-separability. That is, you can have a state of two objects, A and B, such that you cannot represent them as a convex combination of products of their states. So it is as if they both are correlated, and the correlation itself is existing in a state of superposition. And an equally strange outcome of entanglement is quantum non-locality, about which I will speak a while later. These are non-classical correlations between two spatially separated objects. For people with a background, perhaps in computer science, the circuit model seems quite user-friendly, and often one writes the qubit as a line. For example, we could represent it like this, and a classical qubit would be this double line. And in general, any unitary operation is called a gate. So, and a gate is represented so, and then you have measurements, which is represented this way. So as you can see, there's a quantum qubit that leads to it, but what comes out after the measurement is a classical bit that comes out. In all of this, of course, as in the usual circuit convention, you have time flowing from the left to the right. In this case, for example, you can have single qubit and multi-qubit gates. Some very basic and well-known gates are the quantum version of the NOT gate, which is called the bit flip gate or the NOT gate or Pauli sigma X or the X gate, and which is usually written this way. And then you have the Pauli sigma Y or the Y gate, which is written this way, and the phase flip gate, which is a very, sorry, this should be a -1. So this is the Z gate. Each of these gates are basically unitary, but in the case of the qubit, they also have the curious property that they are Hermitian. Their eigenvalues are plus or -1, corresponding to the eigenstates, which are 1 plus or minus p divided by 2, where p is x or y or z, these Pauli operators. And the prototypical 2-qubit gates, so all of these are 1-qubit gates. So you can have 2-qubit gates, which is the C0 gate. So the C0 gate is described here in equation 1. So you have 2 qubits. So the idea of the operation of this qubit is that if qubit 1 is in the state 0, then you do nothing to the second qubit. Whereas if the first qubit is in the state 1, then you apply a NOT gate to the second qubit. Now, the idea of universality is, of course, well known in the classical world. In classical computation, the NAND gate or the NOR gate is universal in the sense that any of the other gates which are necessary for being able to compute any classical function can be built up from any of these gates. So this means that the NOT, AND, or OR gate can be built using only NAND or NOR. And thus an arbitrary operation on n bits can be composed from NAND or NOR. For quantum computation, the equivalent result is that the set of all single qubit gates, which means an infinite number of gates because they are continuous valued, and almost any 2-qubit gate, typically it's the C0 gate, which I just described to you, is universal. Thus, any unitary operation on n qubits, whose dimensionality is 2 power n, can be built from these gates. Now, there's a curious thing that emerged when the field of quantum computation was coming up, namely that a classical gate is not reversible, whereas quantum gates are reversible. So on the one hand, it seemed as if the classical world was allowing for a larger possibility, namely even irreversibility, and yet intuitively you think that the classical world should be obtained as a restriction of the quantum world. So I think this paradox seems to have been floating around for a while before Bennett, as part of his PhD thesis, pointed out the simple but profound fact that indeed, as we expect, the classical computation, the classical world, or classical physics can be obtained from quantum physics. The idea in the context of computation is that by ignoring certain degrees of freedom, we can obtain artificially, so to speak, the required irreversibility that's characteristic of classical computation. For example, let's say we look at the action of a C0 gate. So as I said, if it is 0, then it does nothing. If the first qubit, right, if the first bit is 0, it does nothing to the second bit. But if the first bit is 1, then it flips the second bit. So this is indeed reversible. But if we ignore the first qubit, this actually gives us the XOR gate of the classical computation, which is irreversible. So this way, all classical gates can be realized from reversible quantum gates. And one point worth noting here is that there is a problem that one might think that it's a problem that the single qubit gates are infinite in number, but there's the Solovay-Kitaev theorem, which guarantees that an arbitrary approximation can be done efficiently. So one set of 2-qubit universal gates is the Hadamard gate H, which is actually 1, 1, 1, minus 1, and the pi by 8 gate. So anyway, so the idea of the Solovay-Kitaev theorem is that one can efficiently approximate the continuous gates, even with a finite number of gates. Now, coming to quantum technologies, there seem to be at least four areas in which there are very good prospects where quantum information theory and quantum information processing can be successfully exploited, even to the point where in the first case, namely quantum cryptography, they are commercially successful. So in quantum cryptography, it exploits the no-go theorems like the no-cloning theorem, etc., and non-locality. And you have technologies such as key distribution, secret sharing, information splitting, bit commitment. Of course, the at least one could say a kind of a limitedly successful bit commitment, but of course key distribution that's unconditionally secure, and so on. Quantum computation, it essentially exploits quantum parallelism or Feynman parallelism, if you like, which is the superposition in multi-particle systems, and you have exponential speed up in certain algorithms like Shor's algorithm, quantum simulation, etc., and a quadratic speed up in Grover's search or quantum walk-based search. And quantum metrology, where high resolution, highly sensitive measurements of physical parameters can be obtained, exploiting quantum optical entanglement and quantum squeezing. Again, in quantum imaging, you obtain better than classical resolution or basically non-classical imaging using quantum optical correlations, and it can be applied for quantum lithography, ghost imaging as it's called, quantum subshort noise imaging, quantum sensing, etc. A potential application here, for example, is quantum ranging, which is like a quantum radar, if you like. So a radar which is based on entangled microwave or radio photons, which uses such low power that it can be hidden behind the background noise. And it's useful for security and also non-invasive biomedical applications. So the idea is that we use very few photons and then amplify the signal, in a sense compensate for this weakness via two photon interference with entanglement to detect the distance to certain objects. An ordinary radar would fail at low intensity because of the background noise. But here what we want to use is we want to use the ranging light to be at a very low intensity, but then we make use of quantum entanglement in order to amplify the signal. So this low intensity means that you have non-invasive scanning technique applicable for biomedical applications, and you have a kind of a camouflaging technique in the context of radar applications. So this is the idea here, that you have an entangled source, you have these two signal and the idler photons, and you detect the photon, and the two particle interference is the one that would essentially allow us to obtain the object. I mean, there is a recent work in MIT that has succeeded with this, at least on the laboratory level, and it remains to be seen how successfully this can be exploited on a practical level. Quantum cryptography is perhaps the most well-known application of quantum information theory, and the idea here, of course, is that quantum cryptography is the science of exploiting quantum mechanical properties to perform cryptographic tasks, typically, which is to send messages secretly. And the best known application here is quantum key distribution, which offers, in the quantum case, information theoretically secure solution to the key exchange problem, as against computationally secure key exchange or computationally secure method of sending secret messages, which is the case, for example, in elliptic curve cryptography or RSA based cryptography that we use today in e-commerce. Except for the advent of post-quantum cryptography, as of today, currently used public key encryption systems and signature schemes, example, elliptic curve cryptography or RSA, all of them can be broken by a quantum adversary running, for example, the Shor's algorithm in principle. I write in principle because I don't think quantum computation has evolved technologically to the point where it poses a threat to today's classical security systems. But in any case, I think it's evolved to a point where it is at least contemplatable that such a threat exists. So quantum cryptography exploits fundamental limitations imposed by the laws of physics rather than computational assumptions to provide security. The idea is that we have these typical no-go theorems that aid quantum cryptography, such as the no-cloning theorem, the impossibility to perfectly distinguish two non-orthogonal states, measurement disturbance, and other so-called add-ons such as non-locality and contextuality. The no-cloning theorem that I talked to you about is as easy to describe as it is very profound about its implication. Imagine that you have a cloner. So what would it do? So you have a cloner which takes in two registers. One would be a state which is, the first register is the state that is to be copied, and the second is a blank state onto which the copy is to be made. So if you do have a cloner, then it copies a 0 into a 0 and 1 into 1. Now, because quantum mechanics is linear, and we have these superposition states that I talked to you about. So if you have a state like this, then it's supposed to produce, what happens is that the laws of physics, quantum physics, dictate that a state like this will evolve into a state like this, and not into a state like this, which is the state that you should have if you have two copies. What happens is that if you have a copier like this, which works on orthogonal states, when you have these non-orthogonal states, it fails. Equally well, one can also give an argument which is based on unitarity. Right? So here I've used the linearity property of quantum mechanics. Now I can use the unitarity of property of quantum mechanics to give an argument, to make an argument against the cloning theorem. The idea is, supposing I have again a blank state here and I have an arbitrary state which is prepared here. A cloner is supposed to take this into a state where it's cloned this. But if you take the inner product, let's say with the state which is, so I take the skep, then I can take the bra state of that. And when I look at the inner product, then on the left-hand side, I obtain this number as the inner product, whereas on the right-hand side, I have 1. So this could, in principle, be something that's less than 1, and this is, of course, 1, which is in general not possible under unitary evolution. So so one might say that no cloning theorem is a consequence of quantum unitarity. One can equally well show that if no cloning does not hold, then I can send superluminal signals by exploiting entanglement. So again, one can present an argument, make an argument for no cloning based on the no signaling theorem. Now, probably the most famous protocol, and in some sense which kick-started the whole field of quantum information theory, is the Bennett-Brassard 1984 protocol, which possibly many of you are aware of and are familiar with also. But I can just take you briefly through this. It's also historically interesting because in 1984, it was actually proposed by Bennett and Brassard right here in Bangalore. So, yeah. So here, the idea is that you encode bits to non-commuting basis, which is XRZ, and to transmit 0, you send an eigenstate, the +1 eigenstate of the Z basis or the X basis, and to transmit 1, you send the -1 eigenstate of the Z basis or the X basis, and Bob will randomly measure either the Pauli operator X or the Pauli operator Z. So for reconciliation, Alice and Bob publicly discuss what they measured and only retain those in which their preparation and measurement basis match and throw away the rest. And even on this, on a fraction of these reconciled keys, Bob will announce his outcomes. If there are too many errors, then they abort the protocol. I mean, the idea, intuitively, to give a very naive, simple-minded attack, what Eve could do is that she will measure in the XR Z basis. Her idea is that she will measure it and wait for the public announcement that's going to be made, public discussion between Alice and Bob. And then if she has measured in the right basis, she will try to steal that particular bit. Now, the probability that she escapes detection is that she is half into half. That is the probability that she measures in the right basis and also gets the right outcome, which is 1/4. Therefore, the probability that Eve attacks m qubits in this way and escapes detection falls exponentially in an exponentially small way. So this would be a very simple-minded way of saying that if Eve tries to attack, then because of measurement disturbance, she gets detected almost certainly. Of course, Eve could do something more sophisticated, but this main idea remains that because the information is encoded in non-orthogonal states, the legitimate observers can decode it through public discussion, but an eavesdropper who's got to act before the public discussion is initiated will have to somehow or other disturb the state, and this disturbance can be detected by Alice and Bob. So the B92 protocol is quite similar to the BB84 protocol, except that instead of sending 4 states, only the +1 eigenstate of X and Z is sent. So for example, to transmit 0, Alice just sends the kit 0, and to transmit 1, she sends the plus bit, and Bob will randomly measure in the X or Z bit. And for reconciliation, Alice and Bob discuss which measurements of Bob yielded the -1 and discard the rest. And because Alice's choice is ambiguous in these cases, so the idea is that if they obtain a -1, then Alice and Bob know that Bob has measured in the wrong basis. And so that provides them a basis for sharing a key. Now, by 1992 or so, although the basic idea of quantum cryptography was in place, namely that the idea was that any attempt by Eve to extract information would lead to a disturbance which would be detectable by the legitimate party. So this is essentially an information versus disturbance trade-off that is part of quantum mechanics. So although it was quite clear that this principle would protect secret messages being key distribution, quantum key distribution, it was sometime before it was realized that in practical life you would also have noise, and so the implication of noise should be clearly taken into consideration. So the way that, so in other words, saying that in principle any attack by Eve would lead to a detection by Alice and Bob was not enough, because even if Eve did not attack, you would still have quantum noise, and this would lead to certain errors that Alice and Bob would detect. So every time an error is detected, if they were to abort their protocol, then they would pretty much never actually obtain a key. Therefore, the idea was to show that quantum key distribution is secure, even in the presence of noise. And one step in this direction was identifying that non-locality can play a role in quantum cryptography. So BB84 and B92, the two protocols that I discussed now, show that we don't need non-locality for sharing randomness. Essentially, in those two protocols, there is no entanglement, though there is no non-locality. Indeed, if Alice and Bob can prepare and measure states in a well-characterized way, then security reduces to secure transmissions alone, and this non-locality is not necessary. If this assumption is not practically tenable, then correlations themselves must allow self-testing, the scenario of device independence. So apart from noise, afterwards it was realized that because we're talking about cryptography, we have to make the weakest assumptions that we want. It's not even enough to assume that we have the correct detectors and the correct measuring devices and the correct channels. So when considering that only noise is the central issue in quantum cryptography, assume that only an imperfect channel is a threat. But the device-independent quantum cryptography, one also allows for the measuring devices in Alice and Bob station to be a threat. That is, they could be not so well characterized, and therefore you need a method. You need to have the correlations that Alice and Bob find to themselves be able to make corrections and allow Alice and Bob to securely share information. Now, if at the end of the quantum phase, Alice and Bob's joint probability distribution, which we write in the following form, if they have this following separable form, where P mu is some probability distribution that they may not directly be in control of. Now, one may then assume that if there is a probability distribution in the form which I've given in equation 5, then the variable mu could very well be in the control of Eve. And therefore, the condition for device independence is that we should be able to guarantee that the correlations between Alice and Bob are able to rule out correlations of this type. And that is essentially saying that the correlations should be non-local. And when the non-local correlations are strong enough, then we obtain a guarantee of device independence. So in this context, a particular Bell inequality that I want to talk to you about is, for example, the chained Bell inequalities. So for any n, you can allow Alice and Bob to be two parties, and they are geographically separated. And over a number of instances, Alice and Bob will make measurements on pairs of particles. And each of these measurements will be space-like separated, meaning to say that Alice and Bob will make these measurements almost simultaneously. When Alice measures her measurement, almost simultaneously Bob will make a measurement in such a way that no light signal could travel from Alice to Bob or Bob to Alice in the in the interim time. So let's say that the measurement settings of Alice are A, which take on values like 0, 2, 4, and 2n minus 1, these even values, and that Bob, his settings could be 1, 3, 4. These are just measurement settings. They're just indexes that allow us to write this equation 6 easily. Then the strength of the non-local correlations can be quantified as follows. This is the something called the chained Bell inequality. Yeah, sorry, this is not plus, this should be equal to. So there's the probability that Alice, that is the outcome A, is equal to B for the, I'm really sorry, this should be X and Y, meaning to say that I'm using the convention where the settings are X and Y and the outcomes are A and B. So when the settings are X0 and Y0, then A should be equal to B. And in the other cases, given that the X minus Y is equal to 1, the outcomes should not be equal to, they should not be equal, and the outcomes are just two valued, plus 1 and minus 1. Now for classical correlations, one can show that this quantity will at least be 1, if not greater. Whereas there is a quantum state and settings for which this value can be obtained like this. And so it can be shown that this quantity can be made arbitrarily, though this, this by n should actually be outside. I'll correct it later. Anyway, this can be made arbitrarily low. And so for n, as an example, for example, I can take n is equal to 3 and I obtain this sort of an equation. And to minimize the last three probabilities, for example, we may set xj is equal to yj, but the first probability will then essentially be equal to 1. So, so you see in the classical case, it always is quite, you cannot make it less than 1, whereas in the quantum case, I can make it arbitrarily close to 0 by making n to be sufficiently large. Now, Bell inequalities, as I said, essentially you need a non-local form that allows you, that guarantees that you can show that the correlations are not of the separable kind, or the, what I would say, the local realistic form. And so now let's say you have a source and you have particle A being sent to Alice and particle B being sent to Bob. And if both of them have trusted measurements, then you have the standard quantum key distribution scenario. Now, if you have a source being sharing these photons, and if one of them has untrusted instruments and the other has a trusted instrument, then your quantum correlations need to be stronger. And this can be quantitatively expressed by saying that they should be steerable. And if they are, then what we obtain is what is called the one-sided device-independent quantum key distribution scenario. And when you have a source and both of them are untrusted, they can still check that their correlations are non-local, in the sense that they violate a Bell inequality to a sufficiently strong extent. And uh, in that case, you have a fully device independent quantum key distribution. Again, a related phenomenon in device independent cryptography is device independent randomness amplification. So the idea is that you want to turn imperfect randomness, which can be quantitatively expressed, quantitatively represented by saying that they're epsilon free bits, namely imperfect randomness that is epsilon in variation distance from a uniform distribution, that is from perfect randomness. So we want to turn epsilon free bits into perfectly free random bits, right, which is uncorrelated with any event outside its causal future. So I want to take imperfect randomness and convert it into perfect randomness. So how can we do it? In the quantum world, if you have a Bell inequality violation, then the imperfect randomness can be used to choose measurement settings which will consume these epsilon free bits, namely these imperfectly random free bits, and then you read off the outcome from the experiment, then provided it violates the Bell inequality sufficiently strongly, then the outcomes will give you perfectly free random bits, and such being the strength of quantum correlation. So quantum correlations are so strong that it allows you to make this conversion to go from imperfectly random bits to perfectly random bits. I think, as you know, classically a source of epsilon free bits cannot produce even one bit that is perfectly random. So if you have a source that emits a train of uh, epsilon free bits, which I think is called the Santa-Vazirani sequence, you can still not produce a perfectly random bit in by using any classical protocol. On the other hand, in the quantum case, if epsilon is less than 0.086, so if it's sufficiently close to being perfectly uniform, then you can convert it into a perfectly free random bits. And more generally, if it turns out that quantum theory is not the correct theory, and that you have a higher theory beyond quantum mechanics, but still this theory is non-signaling, then it turns out that you could still do this, but you have a slightly tighter constraint, which is that epsilon is less than 0.058. So if it's sufficiently close to uniform randomness, but it's still not perfectly random, then you can run through this protocol, and if you have a Bell inequality violation, you are able to produce perfect randomness. So what we mean by a non-signaling theory is, for example, the following, that you have P, A, X, Y. So let X and Y, as I said, are measurement settings of Alice, and one is of Bob. And W is a variable, either a variable that is there in the causal past, or which is outside the causal future of the two systems, or it could be a variable in a higher theory. So you're essentially saying that the outcome of Alice is independent of Bob's input, even having the even having access to the variable W. And conversely, the outcome of Bob should be independent of Alice input. So that's what is a no signaling theory. So I'll again now touch upon, I again move on to another aspect of quantum technologies, which is quantum computation. And there are various aspects of it, and now we have interesting inroads being made in quantum machine learning, etc. But I'll just briefly go back to the old idea, perhaps the first idea that sort of illustrated the power of quantum computing, and it's the good old Deutsch-Jozsa algorithm, which essentially provides a quantum solution to the following problem statement, which is that if you have a black box quantum computer, which is a black box, which is an oracle that implements some function, let's say, which takes a function of n bits and produces 0 or 1 bit, and we are asked to determine whether it's a constant function or balanced by using the oracle. So it's promised that this computer or the system that gives an output is this particular oracle by some mechanism will either produce only 0 or only 1, so it's a constant, or it will be balanced, producing equal number of zeros and ones. So the problem is to determine is it whether it's constant or it's balanced. So the motivation of the whole thing is to show a black box problem that is efficiently and deterministically solvable on a quantum computer, whereas a deterministic classical computer would require exponentially many queries to the black box to solve the problem. More formally, this problem, Deutsch-Jozsa algorithm, it yields an oracle relative to which EQP, that is the problems that are exactly solvable in polynomial time in a quantum computer, and P, the problems that are polynomially solvable on a classical, in polynomial time, classically solvable, are different. On the other hand, note that this DJ problem, it can be shown that it is easy to solve it on a probabilistic classical computer. Therefore, it doesn't yield an oracle separation between EQP and BPP, which is the class of problems that can be solved with bounded error in a polynomial time on a probabilistic classical computer. Now, if you want a separation between BQP and BPP, then that is Simon's problem, and that is exactly where even Shor's algorithm comes into the picture. In any case, coming back to the Deutsch-Jozsa algorithm, if you have a classical algorithm, so if n is the number of bits you need to solve it, right, to determine whether a given black box evaluator is constant or balanced, you need 2 power n minus 1 plus 1 evaluations of f in the worst case. So the best case where f is balanced, and the reason is that, yeah, and the first two output values that happen to be selected are different, right? So for the classical randomized algorithm, of course, a constant k evaluations of f is sufficient to produce the correct answer. So you can always easily solve it on a probabilistic classical computer, but if you're using a deterministic classical computer, then you need, in the worst case, exponentially many evaluations. But what we'll find out is that a quantum algorithm produces an answer that's always correct with a single evaluation of f. And again, this is quite simple to show. The idea is we have one register that's prepared in 1 and another n registers to hold the input, and you apply a Hadamard on the first register. As I said, this H is a matrix which is 1, 1 on the first row, 1 and minus 1 on the second row. And then we will have a global function that works on it, again a Hadamard, and then we will perform a measurement. So under the implementation of F in the quantum oracle, what you do is you have X and Y, and the first register remains X, and on the second register you perform the following operation. So you inscribe, this Y plus f of X onto it. Now, if we run the oracle, then I have the first state which is prepared after the Hadamard. I have a superposition of all possible values from x equal to 0 to 2 power n minus 1. And the Hadamard will turn the 1 state into 0 minus 1. So now if I run this function on this, so this is the state that I obtain. Now if it is 0, then notice that this just remains 0 plus 1, and then this remains the same. But if f of x is 1, then this will become 1 minus 0. Or I can just pull out the 1, and this will become minus 0 minus 1. And as a result, what you have is the here is after applying the oracle, I produce a superposition in which the value of f of x is somehow encoded in the face of these bits. Now, I cannot directly interrogate the computer and tell the quantum computer, tell me the one in which you have a minus 1. because that's the solution. I mean, that will immediately tell me whether it's, I can ask it whether you have all of them, all of the amplitudes, are they the same or are they not? You cannot directly interrogate a computer, and you can show that any such direct interrogation would be tantamount to nonlinearity. So, but the idea is to do some clever interference to extract this information which is encoded in the amplitude. And to do that, we first apply again a second round of the Hadamard gate. And in this case, what happens is that so this minus f of x stays here. Then I have the following operation where x dot y is equal to this. I've just manipulated these things and obtained the form which is this. Now you can measure this register in the computational basis. And if I do the probability for obtaining y is equal to 0. So if it's y is equal to 0, let me put a 0 here. So I have f of x here. Therefore the amplitude for obtaining this would be this. Now if it's a constant, then all of these will have the same value. Right? So when I sum this up, this will just give me 1. But if it's balanced, then half of them will give me minus 1 by 2 power n, and the other half will give me plus 1 by 2 power n, and so this will be 0. Meaning to say that if I make a measurement on this, and if I find the answer to be 0, 0, 0, 0, or n copies of 0, then I know that the function is constant. But if I find that it's something other than 0, then I know that it's balanced. So, yeah, so thank you very much, and I hope I am in time, and sort of this concludes my talk, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so very much for a wonderful talk. I'm sure many students and members of the audience will definitely accept your invitation to quantum technology after your inspiring talk. We should take any questions, right?
Hello.
Yeah, hello, yeah.
Yeah, Professor Srikanth, I am Kapil Sharma here.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, yes. Your talk was very nice. Actually, I joined in between. So I had a glance on the quantum algorithms that you discussed about Touch-George algorithm that actually is developed to test a function whether it is balanced or constant, right?
Right.
And of course, it used the black box technique, having registers and encoding the data into the quantum states performed in these registers, if I'm right.
Correct.
And of course, there are other techniques towards the algorithm development. For example, Grover algorithm is using the technique of amplitude amplification.
Right.
And so all these algorithms are actually based on the data encoding in quantum states of a physical system.
Right.
So and in that context, nowadays people moved since last 5 to 7 years that they are also encoding the problems in Hamiltonian of the physical system, right? So how do you feel that in terms of computational complexity, which data encoding method is better, in Hamiltonian or in quantum states, in the context of developing of quantum algorithms for NP problems?
Yeah, so yeah, thank you. That's a very interesting question. Actually, when you talk about encoding the Hamiltonians, and so typically these arise in the original context in which quantum computers were conceived by none other than Feynman, the famous physicist. So the idea is that quantum computers can be used for simulating quantum systems. So you can try to simulate the specific Hamiltonian that is driving the evolution of a certain system in terms of a quantum computer. And so because you have exponential registers that come into picture. For example, if I have n qubits, the dimensionality of it would be 2 power n. So if you try to classically simulate it, then you have to keep track of exponentially large number of numbers. Whereas in the quantum computer's case, because you have the superposition built in naturally, the exponentiality is inbuilt into the system, so you can efficiently keep track of all of these things. So the specific context in which you're talking is a very important one to which quantum computers can be applied, namely using quantum computers to simulate quantum systems. And another thing I want to add is nobody believes that quantum computers can actually solve NP complete problems and so on efficiently. So the class of problems that that which is BQP, that is problems that can be easily solved on a quantum computer, do not encompass, for example, NP complete. So in terms of complexity, yeah, so that is something that I just wanted to add.
Yes. So NP complete is the intersection basically of P and the NP hard problems. If you look at the famous diagram of NP
Right.
non-deterministic, yes, yes.
Yeah.
So, okay,
So
okay,
the
yeah. Okay, thank you so much. Thank
yeah,
you.
welcome. Yeah.
I guess there are no other questions. This will be a good time to stop. So, Dr. Srikanth, on behalf of IEEE IISA Communication Society, kindly accept this plaque as a token of our appreciation and for taking out the time from your busy schedule to deliver such an informative talk.